Welcome to the Magical Overthinkers podcast, a show for thought spiralers, exploring the subjects we can't stop overthinking about, from death to crushes. If you can relate to the feeling that despite living in the information age, the world only seems to be making less sense, if you can connect to the idea that for some mysterious reason, it just feels especially hard to exist as a human in the world right now, then you're in the right place. This podcast is here to help us think less about the things that don't matter and more about the things that do. I'm your host, Amanda Montell. Today, we're overthinking about social media comparison. Greetings, overthinkers. This is your host, Amanda Montell, with an invitation for my listeners who live in the Midwest. I wanted to let you know that I am currently on a very fun live tour. On July 13th, I'll be in Minneapolis at the Cedar Cultural Center. On July 14th, I'll be in Chicago at The Den, touring this over-the-top, super splashy and wacky variety show called The Big Magical Cult Show that I think any listeners of this podcast would really enjoy. This is not your typical live podcast or book tour event. I have some very cheeky drag and burlesque performers joining me. There's a PowerPoint presentation about parasocial relationships. There's really fun audience participation. And the show also features a live version of the Thought Spiral segment that is included at the end of every episode of Magical Overthinkers. There are custom drinks at this live show called things like a dirty anxietini and a French 75 reasons I can't sleep at night. There's merch. There are copies of the Age of Magical Overthinking, a meet and greet, a book signing. It is maximalist. It is so much fun. And I really, really hope you join me again on July 13th. I'll be in Minneapolis. July 14th, I'll be in Chicago. Tickets are still available. You do not need a pre-sale code. The links to buy tickets to the Big Magical Cult Show are at the links in our show notes or at amandamontell.com/events. When I set out to write The Age of Magical Overthinking, I knew I wanted to include a chapter on the existential threat that is social media comparison. This is one of the digital age frustrations that has truly ruined my life at times. Logging onto Instagram, coming across some account that I didn't even know existed yesterday, and instantly perceiving that account holder with her silky hair and her lavish vacations and her impressive book collection as some kind of threat to my identity, my success, my survival. It got me thinking about how the social media comparison that I do now on Instagram, my drug of choice, is different from the social media comparison that I used to do during my teenage years when my only social media platform was Facebook. When I was in high school, Facebook was my second life. It was a whole other social universe to get lost in. I would spend hours uploading extensive photo albums and attempting to make myself look cool on the platform. And I would definitely spend way too much time in the wee hours of certain mornings comparing my photos to other people who went to my school. And this was the difference. I definitely perceived other girls my age as a threat to my coolness, my beauty, all these things I felt pressured to have as an adolescent. But these were people I knew, and there were only so many of them. I guess sometimes I would come across a girl from another school and spiral about her. Reading magazines, I would sometimes compare my body to celebrities. But the quantity of people to compare myself to, though much greater than just people I was encountering in my everyday life, still had its limits. I got an Instagram when I was 20, and in those early days, I wasn't even really posting many selfies. It was mostly just hipstamatic photos of the view outside my Brooklyn window or what I was having for brunch. But by the time I was in my mid-20s, Instagram wasn't just vaguely sepia-toned dog photos and omelet porn anymore. It was an uncanny place to build a brand, to build a perfect alternate hologram version of yourself who went on exotic vacations and always had a new outfit and had nary a skin blemish. And once posts began to get served to us algorithmically rather than chronologically, it became a lot easier to discover the accounts of people you would never meet, who had no direct connection to your life, but still felt extremely threatening as if they did. On Facebook, if some girl from my school seemed prettier and cooler than me, she very well might beat me out for social connections, romantic connections. On Instagram, that wasn't the case. But my body didn't know that. And it would enter fight or flight instinctively, as if I had to go to battle with this random stranger influencer, like we were living in the Neolithic period and needed to compete for mates and food. And that's just the thing. These social comparison impulses are extremely deep-rooted. They have an evolutionary benefit. You can imagine a time in human history when we were living in small communities, when we really were in direct competition with people of our same age and our same sex for scarce survival resources. Our fundamental motivation, mind and body, as human beings, is to outlive threats. And that requires a combination of intense collaboration and competition. For generations upon generations, we wanted to create a positive impression of ourselves so that other people would want to hang around us, again, for survival purposes. And we also wanted to beat out other people in our tribe for opportunities to reproduce and eat. We're now mapping those instincts onto resources that are much more abstract and that don't come in limited quantities, like clout and followers and success. I have more than once, much more than once, had the disorienting experience of just scrolling placidly through my Instagram feed, then coming across an influencer or another writer who seemed enviable to me in some way. And I'd immediately start panic Googling the accolades and education of this new writer I'd just discovered, and then spend a handful of hours mad scientist conspiring how I could inflate my value to beat her in the game of life. Each and every time I did this, the subject of my fevered fixation was a person who I didn't even know walked the earth the day before and had no effect on my life whatsoever. In fact, if this was a person who'd been algorithmically served to me or that I'd stumble across through a mutual follow, in theory, it was a person who I had a lot in common with, who I could message and befriend or collaborate with, so that this situation would not be a competitive one, but instead a win-win. Odds are, if I met this person IRL and beheld the imperfect fullness of her humanity, we could become friends. She would be human to me, and it wouldn't seem like such a threat anymore. But because of the illusory, uncanny, overwhelming nature of social media, it was really hard for me to get there. Moreover, whenever I would get hooked into one of these death helixes of comparison, I would masochistically find myself seeking out more people for me to compare myself to, more perceived threats, as if I was some kind of nomad in the brush looking for predators, except instead I was a spoiled cyborg on the internet and there were endless enemies in scare quotes, to find. This was not good for my mental health, particularly because a 2022 study out of Vaud University of Teacher Education in Switzerland found that where social comparison is concerned, women and girls are much more likely to compare themselves only to the peers that they perceive as superior, and that they learn to do this by elementary school. The consequences of this incessant upward social comparison are material and stark. Another 2022 study, this one from Macquarie University in Australia, confirmed a vicious feedback loop of upward social comparison, problematic social media use, depression, and low self-esteem disproportionately affecting women. In 2021, a study out of Southwest University in China determined that teenagers with TikTok use disorder, aka compulsions to scroll to the point of negative life interference, suffered heightened anxiety, depression, stress, and working memory difficulties. The core features of Instagram and TikTok are precisely what make it so psychologically destructive. They're addictive, they have all these perfectionistic filters. Exactly the accounts that are going to feel most threatening to you are the ones that are algorithmically served. And of course, there are all these incentives only to present these curated highlight reels of your life. All of this creates this delulu competitive environment that sets up women in particular to believe that the world is full of enemies that are threatening to them, instead of potential connections that could actually help them burn brighter through collaboration. We are not adaptively wired to be able to perceive win-win scenarios. And that, combined with social media, has really set so many of us up for psychological failure. One of the techniques that I've been using to mitigate some of these negative effects, and it really has worked, has to do with shine theory. This was a phrase that was coined in a viral piece from The Cut in 2013 by Anne Friedman and Aminatou Sow. The piece says, quote, "When you meet a young woman who is intimidatingly witty, stylish, beautiful, and professionally accomplished, befriend her. Surrounding yourself with the best people doesn't make you look worse by comparison, it makes you better. True confidence is infectious." And if Kelly Rowland can come around to the idea that she shines more, not less, because of her proximity to Beyonce, then there's hope for the rest of us, unquote. Now, when I come across another writer on social media and have that impulse to compare despair, instead I slide into her DMs. I express a sincere sentiment of congratulations and admiration, and if the person lives nearby or is in a city where I'm going to visit, then I offer to connect IRL. I kid you not, I have made dear friends this way, people who I now couldn't imagine in a million years being my nemesis. And yet, these forms of connection are not what patriarchal society or our win-win denying competitive instincts want us to pursue. Social comparison is inevitable. And it's a good thing. We've always looked to other people in our communities to triangulate an identity, to figure out who we are and what we believe, how we should behave. But all of the factors of social media that I've named have made those comparison habits unmanageable. So what can we do to feel better? To continue having this conversation, I want to present 2 conversations with 2 special guests. The first is a more personal chat with Gemma Speg, host of the cult-followed podcast, The Psychology of Your 20s. And the second conversation is a little bit more science-based. That's with the licensed neuropsychotherapist and author of the Getting Unstuck workbook, Britt Frank. Social media comparison is actually one of the few types of magical overthinking that I actually feel like I've been able to work through pretty successfully. All of the studies that I quoted in the intro today are from the chapter of the Age of Magical Overthinking called The Shit-Talking Hypothesis. And if you enjoy this episode, I really think you'll like that chapter of the book. So, without further delay, here's my conversation with Gemma Speg. Well, welcome, Gemma, to the Magical Overthinkers podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks for having me all the way across the ocean.
Could you please introduce your work to our listeners and just sort of the story of how you came to take an interest in and then comment on the psychology of young women in the way that you do?
I run the show, The Psychology of Your 20s. And essentially that show started out of the back of my Subaru Forester back in 2021 after a terrible breakup. It was born from a breakup and needing to find clarity about not just that experience, but the experiences of my 20s. And it was so chaotic and it was so exciting, but also tragic. And I had a background in mental health and psychology. I used to work in the space, kind of dark, but I used to specifically work in child maltreatment and child mental health. So I had the degree, I had all this knowledge, and I was nobody is applying this to this defining decade where we're adults for the first time. Maybe that's what I could do. And I launched the show, and I always say this, for the first year, I got no listens except for my dad and my grandma and my friends. And you would look at my age demographics and it would be 20-something people and then one person above the age of 60. And it's kind of just all spiraled from there. And now it's my full-time job and I speak into a microphone for a living. So yeah, pretty cool.
I don't think any reasonable person expects that their podcast will take off.
No, oh my God, that is so true. I say this all the time. You have to be delusional if you think that you're going to get famous from podcasting. It's such a rarity, but I think that the best podcasters know they have something to say, but don't expect people to really care all too much.
Such a lovely way of putting it. Yeah. And your show is so personable. You are such a lovely, endearing, trustworthy voice and host, and you're really doing something very unique. And I'm so glad you're here because I wanted to start this episode by having a slightly more personal and anecdotal conversation about the topic at hand, which is social media comparison. But before we get into some of those questions, I wanted to open with the very first question that I ask all of my Magical Overthinkers guests, which is simply, what is an irrational thought spiral that has been living rent-free in your head lately?
Oh my goodness. Okay, we're going to get dark and deep. Terrorism has been living rent-free in my head. I just came back from Paris. I live in Australia. I had not seen a gun ever until I was in my 20s because there's just none here. And the amount of people I saw with machine guns, police officers with machine guns in Paris was insane. And then on my flight home, anybody who's done that flight will know it's almost 24 hours that you are on a plane.
Yeah.
And it's a 10-hour flight and then a 14-hour flight. I'm 2 hours into my 14-hour flight and some guy on the plane just loses his shit. and starts like screaming and yelling. And I'm like, all right, cool. So we're going down. That's it. And I just like spiraled. And then it's like kind of stuff with me. Like I went to a soccer game and I was sitting next to my friend and I was like, wouldn't it be so easy to just crash a plane into this stadium? And like, it would be really, like if they really wanted to make a mark. And then I was like, I sound ridiculous. And I realized that I was sitting around a bunch of other people and they were probably all like, let's report that woman for like suspicious timing of like bringing this up. That's my irrational thought.
Super valid. Such a valid thought spiral. Different than the subject matter at hand today. But to sort of bridge the two, if I may dare find the convergence between the two topics, I saw in an Instagram comment section the other day that someone delineated the line between millennials and Gen Z as whether or not you remember 9/11. And obviously 9/11 was like not as big a deal in Australia due to the fact that it didn't happen there. But how old are you?
I'm 24.
Oh my God. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like I grew up sort of fearing terrorism because I was like baptized in 9/11. I was 9. But how fucked up is this? You thought that Paris felt terrifying because of the machine guns. Compared to the United States, Paris feels like this weaponless utopia to me.
Oh my God, that's wild. You need to come to Australia. You're going to have the best time. It's going to be like you've entered the pearly gates of heaven.
I would love to know that feeling.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a nice one.
Yeah, just like never have to fear the concert that you attend being shot up.
God,
sounds really cool. Great. I'm glad you started us off that way because such is like the modern mind, right? Like we are holding all of these things in our brain at once and sometimes they feel equally threatening. So I'm curious if you could sort of tell a personal tale about how you came to social media. What was your social media coming of age and when did you start to feel yourself comparing to others online?
So mine was around like the British YouTuber craze of 2012, 2013.
Zoella?
It was Zoella. God bless her. Zoe Sugg, Tanya Burr, that whole group of people. And I remember watching all their things and being like, wow, her skin is gorgeous. It was the first time I was influenced. They influenced my purchasing habits as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old. I remember going to like my local grocery store and they sold baby lips. And I remember like Zoella was like, oh, I've got like 4 different baby lips in my purse. And I was like, I need to have 4 different baby lips in my school bag. And I always need to have hand sanitizer. And I always need to have these things. And I remember getting very much influenced by that. And then the older I got, I think I had a very early introduction to like Instagram as well. And Instagram aesthetics and like following all these influencers and content creators like ages ago because I was just like so fascinated by it and I always wanted to be these people and they just looked so happy. And it's so interesting that like now I am one of those people and how many comments I get from people being like, oh, you just seem like such a happy person. You just look like you have so many friends. Your life just looks like incredible. And I'm like, the moments when I'm posting the most on social media is when I am the least happy because when I'm actually enjoying myself, when I'm in a healthy mindset, there's no need for me to be that active online because like my reality is better than this fiction. I think that I spent like my first 10 years of my social media life comparing my body and comparing my physique. But now my relationship with it has become so much more complex and nuanced. And now I compare my career and that's really fucking weird. Now I compare things that are even more arbitrary, like likes, like views, like engagement. It's the weirdest thing where I've passed between this like weird film from the consumer to like the creator and and I still feel like comparison rules everything.
Oh my God. I relate to your story so much, even though I'm almost 10 years older than you. I went through the same thing where earlier social media comparison experiences on Instagram and same YouTube. Oh my God. I was such a consumer of YouTube. I was in my early 20s. So my brain wasn't quite as squishy as if, I were 13, but still like very impressionable age. That was a very consumerist time. Yes. I was comparing like my skin, my body, my outfits, and that was compounded by the fact that I worked in the beauty industry for 5 years. When I first graduated college and moved to LA, that was like the job that I could get. No complaints. There are worse jobs in the world, but it did require me to market my appearance and get really caught up in celebrity culture and influencer culture. And when I would log on to my Instagram and, you know, see my explore page or whatever, it was all these beauty editors and influencers on rooftops wearing Reformation who had the trendiest highlights. And I felt like their blonde only made me brunetter, you know? And when I was able to leave that field and focus on my books full time, I thought naively, oh my God, I am freed from comparison purgatory. Like, I am released. No, same as you. My algorithm figured me out. And overnight, I was no longer comparing myself to like the beauty editor from Into the Gloss with the fucking cute Doan jumpsuit. I was comparing myself to like the Brooklyn writer whose debut had just cracked the New York Times bestseller list. And that was worse because it's not just your appearance. It's your like soul. And same with you. This is a little different, but when I was in the like toxic many-year romantic relationship that I was in, during the unhappiest times, I would post the most blissed out looking photos of us on social media as a way to like kind of make up for it. And that was like a consumerist solution to a problem as well. Like, oh, something isn't going well, just post more photos.
Oh my God. Exactly.
Wow. Yeah, I relate so hard. I even told myself that if my book got on the New York Times bestseller list, I would delete all my social media forever. And instead I'm using it more than ever.
Didn't that happen?
Yeah, no, it did. It did. And now, but it's never enough. Like it's never fucking enough. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. And you know what's crazy is like you were talking about like comparing your career and comparing your work is so much worse than comparing your body, because the salve, the balm that we put on our appearance comparisons is like, okay, but like at least I'm a good person. At least I like make good stuff. At least I'm a creative individual. At least I'm like successful in my career. That is how you soothe your comparisons around appearance.
Totally.
And then it's like, wait, okay, I'm a good person. Like, I'm kind. And then it's like, well, there's somebody else who's like actually volunteering their time. What are you doing?
Okay, so here's the other funky thing about that. Like, I feel like my social media persona, and I wonder how you feel, I feel like it's so sort of illusory and shallow. It's like a marketing platform, you know? So like the things that are deeply important to me in my personal life, I don't really share. So like in my mind, I'm like, okay, when I do engage in volunteering, things that mean a lot to me, I'm not posting that on social media because that's just like not my vibe. It feels wrong to me. It feels like cheap. I'm like self-promoting, posting glamorous things. And in the midst of that, I'm going to post something really earnest and sincere about like the love of my life or the volunteer work that I've done. It feels wrong.
Yeah.
But then like I see other people who do post about that kind of stuff and I'm like, oh my God, am I a bad person? And I compare myself one level up of like, okay, there's your appearance, there's your career, that's a little less shallow. Then there's like your altruism or your benevolence. Yeah. Yeah, your values.
Yeah, it's crazy. And you know what's interesting is that I'm one of those people like you who does not share that stuff. Like if you went to my podcast Instagram right now, you would have no idea that I'm in this like long-term relationship with the most beautiful man alive. And you would have no clue that I'm going through like a period of chronic illness. Like you would have no idea. And that like kind of sets it off in your head where you're like, okay, wait, this requires a whole reality reset around how I approach who this person is, what they care about, what they're doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. No, it does. But it's so hard. It's like almost impossible because we can't see what we can't see. So I'm only going to compare myself to the evidence that I have. And I have gotten way better about this, I will say. Like me telling my story right now, I'm kind of talking about maybe like 3, 4, 5 years ago me, because I have figured out some hacks to push past some of these social comparison intuitions that are really bad and painful and self-destructive. And I want to talk about those later. But it has been a fucking journey, because even if you know in your mind that you have a very complex life that is sometimes really ugly and sometimes really boring and sometimes, you know, not like Instagram worthy, for whatever reason, it's so hard to acknowledge that everyone else is the same.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting is like when we examine, and I'm going to bring the psychology into it, when we examine like the psychology behind why we compare, what I find so interesting is that it actually is meant to serve like a beneficial purpose. Like the reason that we compare is because back in the day when we were operating in like a more tribal, smaller system and everything was around securing our survival, our group membership was vital.
Yeah.
You could not be like a lone wolf in that environment. You needed the security, you needed the food sources, you needed the mating opportunities. And so the way to ensure that you were not excluded from the group, which is essentially a death sentence, was by comparing your behavior to that of the group norm and ensuring that you were like conforming to that, ensuring that you were, you know, not within a couple, you know, inches of what was normal. And it's interesting because back then it served such an instinctual and primal purpose, an important purpose. And now we no longer have that broader circumstance around survival, but it's such a part of our old brain and how we like operated when we were truly animals that it still exists in a modern context and it doesn't have a place to go.
100%. I mean, how could our brains have caught up overnight since social media was invented 0.0002 seconds ago in the scheme of things? Of course, we're going to apply those same instincts to our detriment. And I don't know if we'll ever catch up, but
not in our lifetime, at least.
Probably not. But we have to do our best anyways. So I came across a bunch of research for my book suggesting that young women are suffering from social media comparison kind of more than anyone else. And that in part has to do with women's inclinations toward making more upward social comparisons and downward identification. So when a young woman scrolls through her feed, she will not perceive those that could be her equals or those that she might perceive as inferior for whatever reason. She'll only clock the threats, whereas men are primed to do the opposite. And I wonder, like, you're 24 years old, how have you noticed social media comparison more negatively affect the women in your life?
So it's so interesting. I love the point that you made around the distinction between downward social comparison and upward social comparison, because upward social comparison is typically what creates such negative emotional reactions, right? Because when you compare upward, the status quo of that interaction, of that assessment is going to be, okay, well, I feel like shit. Society does a lot more to stoke insecurity in young women. If I've said that to you and that's been like mind-blowing to you, just look at your life. It's everywhere, every fucking where. Not to blame Zoella as like an instrument of the patriarchy, but I didn't need 5 Baby Bell, like whatever they are called, lip balms.
Baby Bell. You do need 5 Baby Bells. Baby Bell cheese.
The cheesies.
We do need 5 Baby Bells.
But I don't need 5 whatever they're called lip balms, right? And so women are also judged more on things that are visible, like appearance. So I think for like people and my friends in particular, and even my younger sisters, I have 2 younger sisters who are like 16 and 18. In almost every conversation that I have, there will be some example of somebody saying something about something that they've seen online. So like, oh my God, did you see that like Alex Cooper just got married? Like, didn't she look so amazing? And it's like, yes, we're giving Alex Cooper, the goddess of podcasting, like a compliment, but it's also like, didn't she look so amazing? And the undercurrent of that is, I could never look like that. And I don't know, it's just like, especially with my sisters as well, I see it so much more, where my younger sister, how influenced she is by trends. That's the other thing that I see. How her personality shifts like every 3 to 4 months around what is trending. How her wardrobe shifts. How her room changes. And speaking of like my partner, who is a man, he does not have social media. He has like an Instagram and he follows like me and his sisters. He is such a stable human. He is not influenced by that shit.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. The stuff that you're saying about your 2 little sisters reminds me of so many things. First of all, I do think that one difference between the early days of social media, the days that I grew up in, versus now, is that fast-paced consumerism. Because on an algorithm-based platform like Instagram or TikTok, you can perceive nearly limitless identities. There is obviously much more of an opportunity to sell things, to infuse others with a scarcity mindset that obviously has self-esteem implications, but also environmental implications. It's sort of presenting this problem like, you are not enough. And also, here's a solution, a Shein haul. Here's a solution, Amazon wishlist. Like, here's a solution, like a new cottagecore bedroom aesthetic.
My sister had that. She was like, can we go antiquing? I was like, why? She was like pestering Tom, my partner, and he like went antiquing with her. And she was like, it was so weird. She kept wanting to buy these like $200 like antique chests. I was like, why? And she was like, it's cottagecore.
That is so funny. But like, That type of thing did not exist when I was coming of age on social media. The other thing that makes me think of is like, it doesn't have to just do with aesthetics. Like my partner, who's also male and also not on social media and thus more grounded.
All anxious social media girlies have their non-social media using partner.
It is essential, truly. But he has an 18-year-old sister, and we were kind of helping her with her college applications. And there was this one essay that she was really struggling with. And I was sort of shepherding her through that process. And one thing I asked her was, I'm sure like on YouTube, you could find like 10 bajillion examples of amazing college essays. Have you tried that? And she literally broke down in tears because all of those examples of people who are thriving, like, oh my God, the amazing essay that got me into Harvard, that doesn't make you feel better instinctively. That makes you feel worse. And that plethora of people to compare your aesthetic, your college acceptances, whatever to didn't exist when I was coming of age. And watching it negatively affect her is really heartbreaking.
It's like, how do we get to that point where it's like every single thing that we do deserves to be put into this like weird Hunger Games environment? That is literally what it is, of like comparison. It's like, who's going to come out on top? Whose essay was the best? It just really does mess with your brain. And I feel like you were probably like, your generation was probably the last generation to have some peace from it. Like you've had probably like 10 years of not having it. And now I think about like your partner's sister, my sister, like they have never experienced a reality in which social media did not exist. And that is disturbing in many ways.
Truly. And when I think about like why this negatively affects young women in particular, I just think it is this like really toxic convergence of algorithms, perfectionistic filters, the addictive nature of social media, the sort of zero-sum game that patriarchy sets up for women. Like there truly are fewer spots in so many arenas of life for women to thrive, to belong, etc.
That is such a good point.
It's a self-esteem nightmare, and no amount of talking yourself out of the fact that there is not a limited quantity of coolness in the world can make you internalize it, you know?
No, oh my God, I really like that there's not a limited quantity of coolness. Oh my gosh, that is such an affirmation. That is literally, that is so cute. I love that.
Okay, let's just slap it on a freaking tote bag. But like 20,000 years ago, there were a limited quantity of berries to share, but there is not a limited quantity of coolness, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I have one more question. Are there any techniques or rituals or practices that you have personally found effective at mitigating the negative effects of social media comparison?
So I think I've matured a lot. Maybe 2 years ago, I made an episode around social comparison. I was like, if they make you feel bad about yourself, unfollow them. Now, I think that is just genuine avoidance. And all you are doing is making that compulsion stronger and making yourself feel worse because you are avoiding actually managing what is at the root of this. So I think when you come across somebody who you're like, wow, that person looks really, really amazing. And I'm so jealous. Like it is envy. I'm jealous. I'm envious of what they've done, of who they are, of how they look. Pause for a second and genuinely be like, and what does that say about my ability to do that as well? Mm-hmm. What does that say about my ability to actually be fulfilled even if I don't have that? And the other thing, especially when it comes to comparison around our careers, that I really value is we talked about upward social comparison, right? And it's like, 70% of instances of upward social comparison are going to result in you feeling really, really terrible about yourself. That other 30%, I think the switch that happens is letting those people set an example and letting them be like a positive example of, hey, if that person did that, that actually just shows me that that is doable, that is achievable. And isn't that like such a fantastic opportunity to learn? Rather than to feel bad, it's to actually be like, what is valuable in this circumstance? If I've seen somebody who I want what they have, they've just shown me that it's possible. I will say that doesn't always apply. I think if you're comparing your physique and you're like, well, look at that, I could be a size 0. I think that is an instance where you need to be like, and what would change about my life if I had their life? Mm-hmm. What is it about their life that I envy that I think would make a huge difference for me? Because when you break it down to its bones, it's like, okay, but like, what does this have to do with me actually living a fulfilling life? Like, do I have my necessities fulfilled? Yes. Right. That's normally what I really get back to, is like the bare bones of where the comparison comes from.
Totally. I mean, it is a worthwhile question. What is the sort of connection between privilege and social comparison and survival? Because those instincts are in a way survival instincts. Mm-hmm. It's just in combination with social media and capitalism and maybe like like too much time on our hands. Maybe that combination has really created a lot of delusion, like hallucination. And that is not to make anyone feel ashamed of it too, because like that just makes it worse. There will always be people who have it worse. There will always be people who have it better, and like feelings are valid, period. But yeah, no, it is an invitation to consider like the role of sort of like being out of your body and spending so much time on your phone, and how there is a privilege in that.
And there is a privilege in wanting things that are not necessary for you to flourish. You know what I mean? I will say like one final tip around social comparison that I always like to think of. I think I said this to my sister the other day, as well as to also think about comparison is not a ladder, it's a circle. And I really like people to visualize this is like, it is not that there is a hierarchy where, you know, you're somewhere on this ladder and you're comparing yourself to somebody better and they're comparing themselves to somebody better. And there is like the perfect human who everybody compares themselves to. But it's actually not like that. It's a circle where it's like, yeah, you're comparing yourself to somebody, but they're also comparing themselves to you. Somebody is looking at your life and being like, I wish I had that. And I think about that with my career a lot, where I'm like, I'm not doing as much as this person, but I'm sure that person is probably looking at my life and being like, oh gosh, like I wish I had so much room for creative freedom, rather than feeling like all these contracts. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's a circle, not a ladder.
I really like that visualization. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it. If folks want to keep up with you and your iconic insights and your unrealistic but nonetheless worthy of following social media presence, where can they do that?
Yes, I would say if you want the realistic, look into my life, you can follow me at Gemma Speg. But if you want to look into my business life and how I'm a #girl boss, you can follow me at That Psychology Podcast. And you should also listen to The Psychology of Your 20s, my baby, my show. It is streaming wherever you get your podcast, wherever you're listening to this, I guess.
Divine. Thank you. After a quick break, I'll be back with my interview with neuropsychotherapist Britt Frank. Well, first and foremost, Britt, thank you for being here on Magical Overthinkers.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Could you introduce yourself and your work to our listeners?
Yes. Hi, I'm Britt Frank, and I'm a licensed neuropsychotherapist. So I do brain things, and I'm a trauma expert. I'm also a former cult member. So I came to your work way, way too late after I was out, but amazing. And I'm the author of The Science of Stuck, the Getting Unstuck workbook. And I'm a former drug addict, hot mess disaster of a human being turned therapist.
Really boring and uneventful life, it sounds like.
Sorry.
I love people with a fucking story. I'm like, if you have not been through it, then, well, maybe you're not the right fit for podcasting. There's at least that. So here we are. We're today talking about social media comparison. My first question for you is, when we compare on social media, particularly to people who have nothing to do with us, nonetheless, they make us feel inferior, unsafe. What in the mind and body is going on?
So let me preface everything I'm about to share with all of this. This is what's happening in your brain. It's not like I have this beat. I do it too. I go down the spirals of why bother? I'm just going to quit and just give up on humaning, because look at all of the internet people doing fabulous internet things. So it's really interesting because the social media comparison, what's happening in our systems will largely depend on what our conscious and unconscious intentions and stories and histories are. But if we're going to sum it up and bring it all the way back down, essentially your brain's like smoke alarms start going off and it's danger, danger, danger. And all of the logic and intelligence and thinking that makes sense is no longer available to you. The lights go out in the boardroom and then everyone in the basement is running around trying to stop the flood, stop the fire, stop the smoke. So it really is on a neurophysical level a threat. It's not really a threat. I'm not saying it's actually dangerous, but to our brains in that moment of comparison does register as a lion. Our brains have not updated fast enough, not nearly fast enough to keep up with what is happening in the shenanigans of the modern worlds.
Totally. You're speaking my language. It's like for the longest time in human history, our problems were not abstract. There was no such thing as sort of like talking yourself out of freaking out to a potential threat. What would the upside of that be?
And I love that you said abstraction, because abstract language, abstract concepts are really the enemy of an anxious brain. Our brains, our brilliant, wonderful brains are very literal, and they will Dr. Spock that shit and be like, okay, I guess you're never going to amount to anything. And if she's drowning, quick, conserve her oxygen and shut her system down so she doesn't drown. Our brains are very literal.
Right. But I'm still confused because seeing like a beautiful influencer on Instagram has nothing to do with a lion. So why aren't our brains like better at figuring that out?
So it's so funny, all the language that we use, if we're talking about how language informs and shapes culture, amygdala hijack and panic attack and I'm battling depression. And again, full disclaimer, I have, quote, battled with mental health issues. Like, my list of DSM diagnoses is not short, and I take meds and I go to therapy. So I'm certainly not minimizing or invalidating the dilemma, but our brains are very good at what they do. As a clinician and as a human, I start with the assumption that this reaction makes sense in context. We don't know the context. Right now, all we know is I'm looking at an influencer who does balloon animals. I have no desire to ever do a balloon animal. And all of a sudden, I'm like, I suck. I'm never going to be able to blow up a balloon or crochet a cactus or knit an octopus or whatever the thing is. And all of a sudden, like, off I go. Let's start with, what if this makes sense? What about this makes sense? Because we always start with, I'm being stupid. I'm being dumb. It's not real. Like, I shouldn't be doing it. We're so quick to say, what's wrong with me? But the better question is, what about this makes sense? Because this would not trigger you if there wasn't an active wound or an active narrative. I don't go digging for trauma memories. That is not what we're talking about. But assume if you're getting triggered, your brain is smarter than we are. It's kept us alive for a long, long, long time. So I'm going to go with, my brain is smarter than TikTok. So if I'm comparing, there's something underneath the hood that needs to be looked at.
Yeah. Okay, that bridges perfectly into my next question, because I can't help but notice that some people me, seem to be more negatively affected by these impulses, these reactions than others. Why do some people seem less bothered by social media comparison? Does it have to do with factors like upbringing, something missing from people's lives? Like, can you talk about some of the factors that might inform whether a person is sort of immobilized and tortured by this or not?
And again, I've been there, done that. I have completely gone into full system shutdown. I also have a history of depression and panic and all of the other things. So I think naturally, if someone is coming into, let me go on my phone from an anxious, depressed, unresourced, unconscious, has never had either the ability or the resources or access to what they need to put the things together. But the bigger the space is between the stimulus and our awareness of why it's triggering, the larger the likelihood is that we're going to be completely knocked on our ass by it. And I really don't think it's the image itself that is doing the majority of the damage. It's like, I see someone, I compare, oh my God, things are happening. But it's not just the thing. It's, what's my story about the thing? How resourced am I? How conscious am I of all the stuff going on in my subconscious that I can act? And it's called shadow work in the woo world, which is just a very la way of saying, deal with your crap that you don't want to deal with. And if you don't know what it is, look at your triggers. Social media comparisons are an amazing access door to undealt with, unaddressed content. But to answer your question, why are people susceptible than others? Largely to do with resources, stories, narratives. Are you PMSing? I know if I look at social media during the 3 days before my period, it's going to hit me differently than when I'm ovulating.
Yeah.
And like it gets that granular for us. It's that powerful. So I'm always mindful, like, be careful what you watch during certain phases of the moon, because hormones do influence how we receive these things.
Yeah. Ooh, that's pretty fascinating. So no matter how hard I try to think my way out of the torture of social media comparison, reminding myself that these are not the full 360 view of someone's humanity, or like the last time I saw that person that I'm now comparing myself to, if I really know them, she looked miserable, or, like using actual data points to soothe myself. No matter how hard I tried, it doesn't really work all the time. And
not at all.
I'm wondering, Why is that?
Yeah, I don't want to get canceled, but like one, we know from the science of motivation in the brain that sometimes fantasizing about doing a thing lands in our brains as if we had already done the thing, which is why it's really important not to overshare your goals, because that gives you that dopamine hit as if you'd already accomplished it. And so sometimes I look at the thing, my brain assumes that I've done it, but then it realized it hasn't. And now I go into a little drug withdrawal. And again, as a drug addict, there's usually some gaps between I want to use, I need to get the thing, I got the thing, I'm using the thing, I'm withdrawing. Social media comparison puts you on that addiction detox withdrawal spiral in split seconds. So sometimes, and it's not our fault. If you don't know, you don't know. But sometimes we're all getting little drug hits and we're all ingesting it because it feels so good to look at the beautiful people. But for a microsecond, we get that rush and then we're immediately thrown into withdrawal. And we don't know that now we're all little drug addicts running around. Fix, use, withdraw, cycle, cycle, cycle. There are these insanely fast little drug addiction withdrawal cycles that are happening. And that's why I don't like it when people say, and again, no shame, I said it too, social media is not real. That is not a good argument to combat the very real shit that's happening in our brains.
Yeah.
So trying to say, well, it's not real. First of all, I've seen some of those people in real life and some of them are pretty real. Like, yes, there's a lot of not real, but like there are legitimately beautiful, fabulous, fit, wealthy, lovely people who make me want to quit humaning. But it's not real does not in any way honor the function of what's happening, nor does it address we're all getting little drug hits off of doing it. And again, I recognize that it's not a 360 view, but what if it was? And so when we try to soothe and again, I do it too, but I try to catch myself now that I know, when we try to self-soothe by taking them down, it's not real. I'm sure they're shitty in real life. I'm sure they're miserable. It's like that actually creates a constriction in our system. It brings things in. And what we want is to feel expansive in a very real way, because that allows our window of tolerance, like the amount of crap we can take in before we either explode or shut down, our window of tolerance gets bigger when it's, okay, what if it's true? What if everything you're seeing online, what if she is that beautiful, that talented, that all of the things? Okay, great. Now what's your core need? What's your core fear? And what's the core wound? Because it would not trigger you if there wasn't a core fear, a core need, and a core wound. And that work is gross. I would much rather just be like, oh, she sucks in real life, so I don't need to compare. But the comparison brings up all the stuff, which begets more comparison, right? Because I don't want to deal with what's in my head. So I'm going to go back online and then get high off of what I see to avoid me, which is then going to create one hell of a mega loop.
Oh my God, that's so clarifying. Yes, because we sometimes shit talk people that we know in real life or see online as a bid to gain something on them, as I guess an attempt at catharsis, but like raging about something never made anyone want to rage less. It just helps you practice raging. And you said something at the very beginning of your answer when you were talking about how fantasizing about a goal can, in a way, sort of like trick the mind and body into thinking you've already accomplished it. Also, speaking of woo-woo, you mentioning the term shadow work, there is this little phrase that one of the culty fitness experts that I interviewed for my book Cultish told me that I really come back to, like I actually found this useful. She said to me, worrying is praying for what you don't want. And like, that is a pithy sort of culty axiom, but it highlighted to me the fact that like, I'm never going to be able to think my way out of pain. Like that doesn't work.
The worrying is praying for what you don't want is pithy, but it's not altogether untrue. And I would add, if we're going with like lib, insta quotable kinds of things, worrying is a way to try to control uncertainty. Like worrying is like a self-harming way to self-soothe your way out of uncertainty. But the reason you can't think your way out of a body response is because it's not just all in your mind. Social media comparison, yes, there's a thinking component, but we live in bodies and our nervous systems are picking up data every second of every day. And then going into our pattern prediction machine files going, what does this feel like? What does this remind me of? And if we want to go to like the social media comparison, quick sort of stop is, what are your choices here? And then it's like, no, but it's like, yeah, but what are your choices here? What are you willing to say yes to? What do you have the capacity to say yes to? Because that's going to actually get to the real problem. But it's so much more fun just to feel like shit and scroll and numb out. Like I dissociate by self-harming through social comparison, just like everyone else.
Yeah. Oh God. Both horrible and comforting to hear. So I just got a couple more questions, and then we're going to get into some thought spirals submitted by listeners. So I don't want to unnecessarily catastrophize that like social comparison is brand new and worse than ever if I don't have to. Still, I'm getting the feeling that social comparison is made worse by platforms like TikTok and Instagram. Do you think that these social media platforms make these existing instincts worse and the fallout worse, or do you think it's just different?
I'm not a tech alarmist. Like, I really enjoy technology. I enjoy all of the things that are coming out. And like anything, it has an upside and it has an evil side, depending on the person using it. So objectively, our brains were not designed to handle information flying at us every second from every corner of the known galaxy. Our brains still run on OS Lion. It's still looking for the lion. It's like, it has not, imagine if you were still using a cell phone that's only updated once. Like, our brains haven't updated.
I do feel like a dial-up bitch sometimes. I'm just like, update already. You know how like your phone will update while you're asleep? I just wish this shit could update while I'm asleep.
But again, if we start with my brain's on my side, and I believe this about all symptoms, including anxiety and depression and addiction, they're all storytellers. All reactions in our bodies are telling a story. We don't have to listen to all of them. It's like every time I got triggered, if I stopped and inquired within, I wouldn't get anything done. But if it's interfering with your ability to live your life, that's when it's time to sort of pull over to the side of the road and like, let's get out the map and let's start taking a look at what else might be going on.
Yeah. Okay, so my last question before we get into this lightning round is, what are some of the sort of material downsides that can come from getting into this impossible cycle of social media comparison, like physically and emotionally? And then what can we do to help overcome them?
So it's helpful to know there's nothing fundamentally wrong with you as a person if you're feeling lethargic, unmotivated, depressed, anxious, even physical like stomach aches and sweat. It can get really bad depending on who you are and the story that you bring to your little phone. So like, this is a physical thing. This is not a mental health purely issue. We are human organisms, and it's affecting our physiological well-being and our psychological health and our emotional health.
Yeah.
All which are compounded when we tell ourselves, I should just get over it. I know this isn't real. What's wrong with me? No. So sometimes all we can do in the moment is validate. Okay, I'm getting high right now. I am choosing to get high right now, but using the language of addiction is going to help jolt, like snow globe your brain out of this ether that we're in of always and never and everyone else and me and stories and narratives. It's like, I'm in withdrawal from hard drugs right now. So now what? That's a really good starting place.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that. Because there is so much shame wrapped up in this pain that a lot of us are experiencing because of social media, because of those mantras that we heard ad nauseum in the early days of social media, when people were starting to be like, well, this is making me feel like shit a lot of the time. Immediately people were like, oh, that's not real. And people still say that. And because it's repeated so much, we think like, oh, well, this pain isn't real. And now here's shame on top of that.
Exactly. And underneath that, if we're going to drill all the way down, if whoever's comparing to anything, if we drill it down, it's going to come down to you have choices to improve things, and that's going to be hard and it's going to suck. Or this is not for you. It's never going to be for you because reasons, and therefore we have to grieve. Show me someone who's talking about why people need to understand the grieving process if they're going to be savvy social media users, and you're going to get a lot of deer in headlights, because we don't even do grief well when it comes to death. Let alone, it's like, I'm grieving that I'm comparing myself. Meanwhile, genocide. Meanwhile, people are dying. And it's like, yes, I'm not saying that yours is worse. I'm saying that at the end of the day, you can either make a choice to do a thing, or you have to grieve that you don't have the choice to do that thing. So it's choose or grieve is really what we're talking about here.
Whoa. Yeah, I'm glad that you're phrasing it this way, because if I were miraculously to come to these ideas on my own, I would probably feel like I'm being overdramatic. But because you're saying it, It's real.
Because science, these are not my theories.
Yeah.
These are people who have studied the brain for decades and decades saying this is how your brain brains and this is your brain on social media.
God, I love the language trend where all nouns are becoming verbs now.
I know.
You
It's
know?
so great.
It's so fun.
It's like your brain is braining.
Your brain is braining. Humans are humaning or failing to human. I love that. God. Linguistics, my first love. Okay, now we're going to get into a little lightning round where I am going to read to you some thought spirals and delulu overthinky thoughts that were anonymously submitted by the Magical Overthinkers Club, aka our listenership on social media. If you would like to submit a thought spiral about an episode topic in the future, follow us on Instagram at Magical Overthinkers. So I'm going to read some of these to you. You're just going to give your quickie lightning round reaction if you are so able. You're a fast talker like me, so I have faith in you.
Let's go.
Okay. The first thought spiral is there a psychological reason why I still look at my 9th grade bully's Instagram?
Oh, well, first, I do it too. The short answer is yes. The long answer is there's grieving work to be done there, which sucks. Sorry, but yes.
And doesn't it also suck that you're able to go and look at your 9th grade bully? Like, we're not just given the gift of forgetting anymore.
But instead of beating yourself up for doing it, is there a psychological reason you're doing it? Yes. So use that information as a trailhead. So that's not a thing anymore. And you'll know it's not a thing when you're no longer compelled to look at your 9th grade bully's social media.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like, there are people that I lurk because they still feel urgently threatening to me. And then there are people who harmed me in the past who I don't lurk at all. I guess because I've released them. It always says something about us. Okay, next thought spiral. If I fear judgment, does that mean that other people do too? Or am I just projecting?
Yes, to all. You fear judgment, you're projecting, and I fear judgment and I'm projecting. So everyone fears judgment. I've treated people at the top of their game across multiple industries. Everyone has the I'm full of shit part. Everyone's afraid of judgment. It is not you. And yes, you're projecting too.
Nice. Next thought spiral. So we've addressed this, but maybe something new will come up in response to the way that this was phrased. How are we still getting sucked in by social media, even though we all know it's fake?
Well, I know certain things are bad for me, but I do them anyway. Like, habits are hard. Once our little brains go on autopilot, then it's really hard to break a habit once it's installed in the autopilot settings. Mm-hmm. So it's a thing. It is absolutely a thing.
Yeah.
And if you want to start breaking that habit, snow globe your brain, do something different, do weird shit, like get dressed in a different order, eat a different breakfast, take a different road on the way to work. Anything that takes your brain out of autopilot is going to help with the impulse to repeat, which is not insanity. That is not insanity.
Right. Yeah, because my understanding of it, and I ain't a brain scientist, but I have heard frequently, and maybe you can fact check me, that like we are literally strengthening neural pathways when we do the same thing, think the same thought, engage in the same behaviors. We basically are building like a multi-lane highway to thoughts that we don't want to think by thinking about them.
Exactly. And it's not as easy as just stop. So if you're doing the thing, immediately overlay a different thing. If you're looking at your 9th grade bully, like immediately pair that with a funny cat video and start to move yourself out of the 5-lane superhighway and throw some gravel on the road over there. Because you can keep pairing things. Eventually you're going to help build a different road. So
yeah, like a cute little cobblestone side street with lots of beautiful cafes on it
where you can read. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, great. Next thought spiral. What will be the end of influencers? And by influencers, they mean sort of like the super aspirational artificial kind. What's the longevity of the luxury lifestyle?
I would ask, what are you really asking me there? What do you want to know? Are you asking, when will I see the downfall of the beautiful people? Are you asking me, is this ever going to be me? Are you asking me, will I ever be loved? I don't know what the answer is because I'm not an oracle and I don't have a crystal ball. I will say there is a fascinating question under that question, and I'd be really curious to know what it is. But I don't think that culture is going in. If your question is it going away? The answer is no. It's been around from time immemorial. It'll change flavors, but it's not going to be not a thing.
Right. As long as there have been goods, there has been social hierarchy.
Influencers.
Yes, right. Influencers of some ilk. Okay, 2 more thought spirals. Next one goes, how harmful can Facetune really be if everyone's doing it?
The argument that because there's a population of people doing the thing, therefore it's not harmful, just because it's popular does not mean it's good. Just because it's normal does not mean it's good. There are a lot of normalized things that are really, really effing bad for us. So how bad can it be? Very. Even if everyone's doing it,
I would also argue that everyone is not doing it, but we clock the people who are because those are the people who seem threatening to us, and we just blitz past the people who look authentic or who look, non-threatening. Which
selectivity bias, yes.
Yes, indeed. Last thought spiral is actually related to the one prior. This thought spiraler goes, I'm overthinking about how much the Photoshop is fucking up kids on this app. Yeah, can you talk about the sort of generational divides in how social media comparison is affecting us?
Yeah, and I had a kids practice for years. I was a play therapist. So as an adult, choose your own adventure. If you want to go do your thing, have at it. But when it comes to kids, and I'm not a parent. I don't have children. So I would never shame a parent or tell a parent how to parent. I'm speaking as a former little person and as a provider too. I speak child. I don't speak parent. It's really harmful to kids. Think about as an adult, how overwhelmed do you feel? I know after I'm done with a scrolling binge, I feel like I just got hit in the face.
Yeah.
And it's for a little human whose brain is not even fully baked until they're almost 30. Mm-hmm. Again, no shame. If you're a parent and your kid's on social media, I get that's the world we live in. And I get that we need to adjust as a society and a culture to accommodate the reality of tech. But little human mushy brains need a lot of boundaries and a lot of education and until a child has feelings literacy and can communicate their inner reality skillfully, I don't think they have any business being on socials, because how are they going to tell their parent, I don't feel good in my tummy? After looking at this all day, what does that feel like in your body? Ugh. Oh, I feel kind of like I have a brick on my chest and I feel like there's a big dark black ball in my tummy.
Yeah.
If your kid doesn't know how to do that, I would say proceed with caution.
Yeah. But then it's so hard because I've heard the argument, when I think about my future and, what raising a kid in the age of social media would look like, some who have kids, or I've heard through the grapevine, and this relates back to that question having to do with if everyone's doing it, how harmful can it be? Parents are like, well, my kid is saying that everyone else has social media and they don't want to feel like an outcast. So then maybe
It's true.
Yeah. So
it's true, unfortunately. So then it's what do you do?
Yeah.
And the answer is, what are the choices? I don't know. Because again, I'm not trying to raise children. In a perfect world, we'd have this little rebellious sect of growing humans that can human together in the absence of it. But I get you're going to have very real social consequences and isolation if you are not part of the thing. So I'm not saying it's all or nothing. And again, systemically, our systems are not set up to accommodate the needs of parents. So a parent who is burnt out from every angle and is it's either give my kid the screen or I'm going to run away and something bad will happen. I'm I got you. That's a systemic failing, not a moral issue. Right. So I am not shaming parents.
Totally. I mean, that's why so many people are making the argument, including Jonathan Haidt, the writer of that new book, The Anxious Generation. I think he's made the argument many, many times that smartphones should be banned from schools. And then there's a whole argument of I don't know, just social media is bad for kids. I think it's fair to say that. And just anecdotally, sometimes I'll be lurking around on social media and I'll see comments on someone's post. The post seems totally innocuous to me, but I'll see comments where people are being really mean, just really gnarly. And I get sad because I'm I don't feel like I can relate to my fellow human because I would never behave this way. How could a decent, fully formed person behave this way? And then sometimes I'll click on their profile and it's a kid. It's a 13-year-old. And I'm well, no wonder they're behaving this way because they're not fully baked, like you said.
Well, the problem is when I grew up, if it's you said that to someone, you got beat up.
Yeah.
And I was bullied relentlessly, even prior to the advent of social media. But now you can say whatever you want behind the screen. So the education needs to be different. It's why are we not teaching social media literacy in schools or having you have to be licensed to drive a car?
Exactly.
Do you understand what this is and the rules of the road? And it's the Wild West for still. And I don't have a solution. I just know it is a problem.
Yes. Oh my gosh. So true. I lied before. I do have one very, 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 very last question for you. And it is, what do you think is the one thing that people are overthinking the most when it comes to social media comparison? And what is the one thing you think people are underthinking the most?
I think they're overthinking how messed up they are and how broken they are. And they're underthinking how normal this is and how much choice power is actually available once you understand this is a thing. It's not a you thing, it's a we thing. And there are things to be done about it. Like overthinking the problem, underthinking the solution.
Wow. Well, thank you so very much for joining this episode of Magical Overthinkers. If folks want to keep up with you and your work and your insights, where can they do that?
You can find me on Instagram because I will be there comparing myself at Britt Frank. And the new book, the Getting Unstuck Workbook, just came out. And my first book, The Science of Stuck, is all available wherever you buy books.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to these two conversations. Here's the part of the episode where I share a little tidbit of evidence-based advice for how we overthinkers can get out of our own heads this week. This comes from therapist Samantha Boardman, MD, writing for Psychology Today. And it has to do with a visualization exercise that can help us put our negative thoughts into perspective. It's called the fish hook. Boardman writes, "Thoughts are like fish hooks, and you are a fish swimming around in the water. You can't control how many fish hooks you come by, but you can decide whether you swim past them or take the bait. It is impossible to avoid some thoughts as you go through life, and sometimes you will take the bait, but you can still choose to unhook yourself and swim past the other hooks." And with that, thank you again for listening. Until the next spiral, remember, think it over, just don't overthink it. Magical Overthinkers was created and hosted by Amanda Montell and edited by Jordan Moore of The Pod Cabin. Our theme music is by Casey Kolb. Thank you to our magical manager, Katie Epperson, coordinator, Reese Oliver, and Network Studio 71. Be sure to follow the pod on Instagram at Magical Overthinkers. We're also on YouTube, link in show notes, and ad-free episodes as well as behind-the-scenes extras are available on the Magical Overthinkers Substack at amandamontell.substack.com.